The night in Naples is never silent. Even when the shutters are closed and the streets seem deserted, there's always a hum, a whisper, a restless pulse in the air. The city breathes differently after dark, its soul tucked away in narrow alleys, behind iron balconies, and beneath dim lights that flicker on weathered stone walls. It was in this city, hidden within its folds, that a man carried a name too heavy for his shoulders, Salvatore Riina Jr. To most, the name Riina was a warning, a curse. His father, Salvatore Toto Riina, had been the most feared boss in Sicilian Mafia history, a man who ruled Palermo and beyond with iron fists and endless bloodshed. The elder Riina was known as the Beast, and his reputation was written in violence. But his son had inherited not the throne, but the shadow. And living in the shadow of such a man was not power. It was a prison. From childhood, Riina Jr. understood the rules of silence. He was never simply Salvatore. He was always the son of Toto. In every room he entered, every alley he walked through, people saw not him, but the reflection of his father. Respect was not his to earn. It was forced upon him, tainted with fear. But fear never made a man free. It chained him to a ghost. And so, while others might have grasped at the chance to command, to rise, to claim the legacy, Riina Jr. chose something stranger. He chose to disappear within it. Naples became his refuge. Unlike Palermo, it did not carry his father's blood on its cobblestones. The city was already crowded with its own ghosts, its own families, its own battles fought in whispers behind shuttered windows. Here he could blend in, not as the son of the Beast, but as just another quiet man moving through unmarked doors. The city welcomed him in its own way, not with warmth, but with indifference. And sometimes indifference is the safest place to hide. Still, a name like Riina could never be fully buried. There were those who sought him out, curious if he carried the same fire as his father. Some approached in fear, some in hope, others in greed. They wanted to know, would he lead as his father had led? Would he continue the war, the vendettas, the bloody legacy that had torn Sicily apart for decades? But Salvatore Jr. was not his father. He was not the Beast. He had no hunger for carnage, no desire for empires built in gunfire. Instead, he built fronts, small businesses that looked ordinary enough, cafes where the espresso was bitter and strong, small shops with dusty shelves, apartments with curtains drawn. He moved quietly, keeping everything measured, calculated. If his father had roared, he would whisper. If his father had conquered through fear, he would survive through invisibility. And yet, the bloodline lingered. It was impossible to escape. In the silence of his own thoughts, he carried questions that no ordinary man could carry. Was he forever bound to his father's sins? Could he ever live a life of his own making, or was he destined to be just another chapter in the Riina story? Sometimes at night, as the city outside settled into its rhythm of muted footsteps and distant laughter, he would sit in his apartment and listen to the sounds of Naples. He thought about the old days in Sicily, when his family's name commanded not respect, but fear sharp enough to freeze men in their tracks. He thought of the men who had sworn loyalty and the men who had disappeared. He thought of his father, locked away in prison, yet still haunting him like a shadow he could never outrun. But in Naples, Riina Jr. made a different kind of pact. He sought alliances not in violence, but in discretion. The men who dealt with him knew that he did not demand loyalty through blood, but through silence. He asked for nothing loud, nothing that would bring the gaze of the law, nothing that would echo like gunfire in the streets. His power, if it could be called power, was softer. It was the kind that slipped unnoticed, like smoke through a keyhole. The streets around him carried stories of their own. Old Mafia legends of Naples, Camorra clans who ruled entire districts, families who had turned poverty into power by commanding fear. They watched Riina Jr. closely, unsure whether to see him as a threat, a rival, or a ghost. But he was none of those things. He did not rise to challenge them. He did not compete. He simply lived quietly, steadily, like a man trying to breathe beneath the weight of his father's shadow. And yet, even in quiet, a man cannot escape who he is. The very air around him seemed to carry the whispers of his bloodline. The surname was enough to open doors, enough to close others, enough to draw eyes that lingered too long. He did not seek power, but power sought him. He did not claim inheritance, but inheritance claimed him. So, as he walked the narrow streets of Naples, beneath laundry lines swaying between balconies, past women selling vegetables in hushed voices, past children playing football until midnight, he moved like a man half buried in history. Every step he took was measured, every glance was careful. For Salvatore Riina Jr., life was not about ruling. It was about surviving. Surviving a name, surviving a legacy, surviving a shadow too vast to escape. This was not a story of gunshots or vendettas. It was not about the wars of fathers and the blood they spilled. This was about a quieter inheritance, the kind that weighs down on a man's chest when the world believes he is destined to become something he never wished to be. In the hidden corners of Naples, in unmarked doorways and shuttered windows, the son of the beast walked softly. He carried a name the world could not forget, even if he wished he could. And though he did not seek to be a Don, or a boss, or a king, the ghost of that crown lingered, always just out of reach, reminding him that some legacies are never escaped. They are only endured. And so begins his story. A story not of carnage but of whispers. Not of conquest but of survival. Not of a man who ruled through fear, but of a man who lived beneath it. The story of Salvatore Riina Jr., the heir to a shadow. Naples is a city built on contradictions. In the daylight, it is a place of chaos and color. Markets spilling onto sidewalks. Children shouting in alleyways. Motorbikes weaving through impossible traffic. But by night, Naples changes. The shutters close, the streets quiet, and the city folds itself into secrecy. Behind those closed doors, lives are lived in silence, deals are made with whispers, and stories unfold that never reach the daylight. It was into this silence that Salvatore Riina Jr. stepped. He did not arrive as a conqueror, nor as a man who demanded recognition. He came quietly, almost unnoticed, slipping into the city as though he belonged there all along. He chose Naples precisely because it was already crowded with shadows. The Camorra ruled its neighborhoods with invisible hands, and their presence was so deeply woven into the city that no outsider could ever hope to untangle it. In such a place, a man with a dangerous name could disappear. But disappearing is not the same as being forgotten. Even in Naples, the name Riina carried weight. Whispers spread in back rooms, in cafes where men leaned too close over small glasses of espresso, in smoky card rooms where time seemed to stand still. They spoke of the son of the beast, the heir of Palermo's terror. They wondered what he wanted, what he sought. Did he come to claim a piece of Naples, or was he merely hiding from the ghosts of his father's past? Salvatore gave them no answers. He built a life made of shadows, one step at a time. His days were marked by routine. Mornings spent in quiet cafes, where he read newspapers without ever finishing an article. Afternoons wandering streets that twisted like a labyrinth. Evenings spent in modest apartments with curtains drawn tight. He was not a man of excess nor of spectacle. He carried himself with the restraint of someone who had learned early in life that attention was dangerous. Yet there was calculation in his quietness. To survive under a name like Riina, he could not afford recklessness. Every word he spoke was measured, every move deliberate. He made acquaintances, never friends. He formed connections, but never bonds. Those who dealt with him soon learned that he did not ask for loyalty in the way his father had demanded it. He asked only for discretion, and in Naples, discretion was currency. The Camorra clans watched him closely, unsure what to make of him. Some saw him as a potential ally, a man who carried a legacy of fear that could strengthen their own hold. Others viewed him as a threat, a spark that might ignite old rivalries or bring unwanted attention from the authorities. But Salvatore did not challenge them. He did not raise an army, did not rally soldiers, did not demand tribute. Instead, he seemed to fold himself into the city's fabric, becoming one of its many shadows. It was a strange inheritance, this life he had chosen. His father had ruled Palermo through terror, his power carved into the city by blood and fear. But Riina Jr. ruled nothing, not even himself. What he carried was not power, but weight. The weight of a name that opened doors he never wished to walk through. The weight of expectations he had no intention of fulfilling. The weight of eyes that followed him, always waiting to see whether he would become his father's son in truth. At times, the silence pressed heavily against him. In the quiet of his apartment, with only the hum of the city drifting in through closed shutters, he would think of Palermo. He remembered the years of chaos, the men who disappeared overnight, the funerals held with more fear than mourning. He remembered the prison where his father remained locked away, still commanding loyalty from men who had never seen him free. He remembered the legacy written in headlines, in trials, in the stories that Sicilians whispered long after the wars were done. But here in Naples, he told himself things could be different. Here he could live in the margins, not as a dun, but as a man trying to outlast his own bloodline. He surrounded himself with small fronts, businesses that gave him cover but demanded little. A corner cafe where regulars argued about football and politics. A shop that sold nothing of real importance. Apartments rented under false names. To anyone looking too closely, the operations appeared dull, almost pointless. And that was precisely the point. Invisibility was his shield. But invisibility has a cost. It meant living without attachment, without belonging. He was a man present but never seen, existing in a city that allowed him to breathe but never truly welcomed him. Naples did not embrace strangers. It tolerated them. And for a Riina, tolerance was the most he could ever hope for. Still, there were moments when the city itself seemed to whisper to him. In the narrow alleys where children played late into the night, in the courtyards where neighbors argued loudly only to laugh moments later, in the churches where candles flickered against centuries, old walls. Naples reminded him that life could continue even in the shadow of ghosts. The city had endured empires, wars, and plagues. It had endured the rise and fall of clans. Perhaps he, too, could endure. But endurance is not the same as freedom. Freedom would mean leaving the name behind. Freedom would mean walking into a room where no one knew his father's shadow. Freedom would mean living as Salvatore and not as Riina. But names are chains, and his chain was unbreakable. And so, each night, as the city outside whispered its secrets through shuttered windows, he remained hidden. He was a man walking through life quietly, carefully, always aware that the bloodline he carried could never truly be silenced. The Camorra still watched. The whispers still spread. And though he did not seek power, though he had built a life of whispers instead of war, the question remained. Could a man born into such a legacy ever truly disappear? In Naples, beneath the laundry line swaying in the night breeze, beneath the weight of centuries of shadows, Salvatore Riina Jr. kept walking. He was not the beast. He was not his father. He was simply a man with a name too heavy to carry, and nowhere to lay it down. In Naples, nothing goes unnoticed for long. The city is a labyrinth, but its people are its mirrors. Every stranger is measured, every newcomer quietly observed. Eyes watch from behind shutters, from balconies where laundry sways in the breeze, from the corners of cafes where conversations fall silent at the wrong moment. And when Salvatore Riina Jr. settled into the city, those eyes turned toward him. At first, there was curiosity. He was not like the others who drifted through Naples, searching for fortune or hiding from failure. His name carried weight, the kind of weight that bends a room even when spoken softly. The son of Toto Riina, the beast of Palermo, the man whose orders had scarred an entire nation. To some, the son's presence felt like a warning. To others, it felt like an opportunity. But to all, it stirred unease. The Camorra clans, who had ruled Naples long before his arrival, watched most carefully of all. They were not like the Sicilian Mafia, where Sicily had been bound by rigid codes of silence and hierarchy. Naples thrived on something looser, more chaotic. The Camorra was not one family, but many, a web of clans woven into the very streets of the city. They were unpredictable, but they were also deeply territorial. And in their territory, a Riina was both an intruder and a question mark. Did he come to challenge them? Did he intend to stake a claim in their city? Or was he merely passing through, a ghost wearing a famous name? The truth was quieter, almost disappointing. Salvatore did not storm into Naples demanding respect. He did not raise his voice, did not call upon his father's soldiers. Instead, he slipped into the city with an almost deliberate smallness. He opened shutters without drawing attention, walked the streets without leaving a mark, sat in cafes like any other man. He lived as though the city itself might swallow him whole if only he stayed still long enough. But men with names like his can never be ordinary. The whispers followed him wherever he went. A barista, pouring his coffee, leaned a little closer than necessary, as though hoping to catch a glimpse of danger in his eyes. Old men at the corner table in the piazza watched in silence, measuring the way he carried himself. Women in the market spoke his name under their breath, wondering if the son of a monster could ever be different. The Camorra leaders sent feelers, quiet approaches, conversations that seemed casual but carried undertones of testing. They wanted to know what he was: a rival, an ally, a man who would demand his father's throne, or a man who had run from it. Salvatore offered them nothing. His answers were vague, his tone even. He spoke of simple matters: business, survival, routine, never of ambition, never of blood, and that, in its own way, unsettled them more than if he had arrived in violence. A man without ambition could not be predicted. He could not be bribed by promises of empires, nor threatened by the risk of failure. He asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and yet his very silence made him dangerous. For silence could mean patience. Silence could mean a man waiting, calculating, biding his time. The streets whispered with speculation. Was Riina Jr. merely a shadow, surviving beneath the weight of his father's name? Or was he the seed of something new, a quieter kind of power that would grow slowly, invisibly, until one day it could not be ignored? But Salvatore himself seemed uninterested in their questions. He carried himself with a detachment that confused even those closest to him. He ran his small fronts, shops that barely turned profit, apartments that seemed more empty than occupied. To him, invisibility was success. Each day that passed without drawing attention from the law, without igniting the interest of rivals, was a day he had won. And yet, even as he hid, he was never truly hidden. The people of Naples continued to measure him, continued to weigh the possibilities of his presence. Children whispered in alleyways, daring one another to walk past the cafe where the man with the heavy name sat each morning. Men muttered in card rooms, debating whether he would inherit his father's violence or bury it beneath silence. Women watched him from balconies, wondering if he lived like a ghost because he had no choice. The Camorra leaders remained divided. Some believed he was harmless, a man so broken by his father's shadow that he could never rise above it. Others suspected the opposite, that his quiet was a mask, and behind it, something dangerous was being built. They waited, they tested, but they did not strike. Naples was a city of patience as much as chaos, and they knew better than to act too soon. For Salvatore, this constant observation became a part of life. He felt the weight of those eyes, but he had grown up under heavier scrutiny. In Sicily, every move of his family had been watched by rivals, by allies, by the law. The attention in Naples was softer by comparison. It was not the gaze of men planning vendettas, but of men trying to solve a riddle. And so, he let them wonder. He let the city question and speculate while he slipped deeper into its fabric, quieter with each passing day. Still, in the privacy of his own thoughts, he could not escape the irony. He had not sought power, yet he was treated as though he carried it. He had not asked for fear, yet fear lingered around him. He had not wanted inheritance, yet inheritance lived in his very name. He was a man trying to be invisible, made visible only by the shadow of his father. At night, when the city dimmed into whispers, he would sometimes walk alone through the narrow streets. He passed churches older than memory, stairways carved into stone, doorways that led into hidden courtyards. The city seemed endless, a maze of secrets within secrets. And in those moments, he almost believed he could lose himself in it completely. Almost. But then the eyes would return. A curtain shifting in a window. A figure lingering too long at the end of the street. A silence that seemed heavier than it should. The reminder was always there in Naples. Nothing went unnoticed. And so Salvatore Riina Jr. lived beneath watchful eyes. He did not fight them, did not flee from them. He simply endured them as he endured everything else. His life was not about ruling or conquering. It was about survival in plain sight, hidden not by absence but by restraint. In a city of whispers, he became another whisper. And yet, because of his name, his whisper was louder than most. Every man inherits something. Some inherit land, others inherit wealth. Some inherit nothing but stories passed down like fragile heirlooms. But Salvatore Riina Jr. had inherited a name, and with it, a silence so heavy that it pressed against every breath he took. His father, Toto Riina, had filled Sicily with terror. For decades, his voice had been law, his orders shaping the lives and deaths of hundreds. Palermo had trembled beneath his shadow, and even when prison walls closed around him, the beast's roar echoed through the streets. That was the father. And for the son, there was no inheritance of riches, no estate, no legacy to embrace. Only the silence. It was the silence of rooms that fell quiet when he entered. The silence of conversations that ended when his surname was spoken. The silence of people who expected violence from him, even when he offered none. It was the silence of a destiny already written, one he had not chosen yet could not escape. From a young age, he had been taught the unspoken rules of his world. In his household, words were dangerous things. Too much talk could betray you. Too much honesty could kill you. His father had spoken in commands, in sharp directives, never in tenderness. Affection was a weakness, and weakness was never allowed. The lessons were clear: silence was survival, obedience was life, and fear was the only currency worth anything. But Salvatore had never been his father. Where Toto had thrived in violence, he recoiled from it. Where Toto had found strength in control, and he found only suffocation. And yet the world did not care for his differences. The world saw the bloodline, not the man. In Naples, far from Palermo, he carried that inheritance like a shadow stitched into his skin. He tried to disappear into ordinary routines, to dissolve into the background of a city already overflowing with its own legends. But the weight followed him, pressing against him in the quiet moments when he was alone. Sometimes he would remember prison visits. He remembered the way his father's eyes had burned through the glass, sharp and unyielding, even in confinement. There had been no softness in those meetings, no hint of regret. His father had not apologized for the lives taken, for the blood spilled, for the fear that had poisoned their name. Instead, there had been an expectation, a demand without words, that the son would carry on what had begun. It was not a request. It was a command carved into his blood. And yet Salvatore had resisted, though resistance was never loud. His rebellion was quiet. A life lived in whispers instead of shouts. He did not gather soldiers. He did not draw maps of conquest. His weapons were patience, discretion, and invisibility. In a world where men had died for shouting too loudly, he chose to survive by saying almost nothing at all. But inside, the conflict was constant. He asked himself questions that never found answers. Was it betrayal to live differently from his father? Was it cowardice to refuse the legacy? Or was it courage to deny the cycle, to try and become something other than the shadow of the beast? The city of Naples became both a refuge and a mirror for these questions. Its narrow streets, its shuttered windows, its endless secrets. Naples lived in silence too, just as he did. But unlike him, the city had turned silence into resilience, a way of enduring centuries of conquest, hardship, and power struggles. For Naples, silence was survival. For Salvatore, silence was prison. Each day was a balance between disappearing and being consumed. He built fronts not because he wanted to, but because he needed to give his presence shape. Cafes, shops, apartments. They were shells, nothing more. They allowed him to exist in plain sight while hiding in the open. But every false front reminded him of the truth. He had inherited not a business empire, but the art of concealment. Still, the shadow of his father loomed. He could not escape the comparisons. In whispered conversations, in careful glances, in the heavy silence of those who recognized his name, the question lingered. Would he ever step into his father's role? Would the son of the beast ever roar? He never answered, because there was nothing to answer. He was not his father. He did not crave the roar. He only wanted to breathe. And yet the silence carried danger of its own. Because to some, silence was not neutrality. It was suspicion. It was patience disguised as humility. The Camorra leaders, the local bosses, the men who thrived on control, they watched him, unsure whether his quiet was weakness or the calm before a storm. And in that uncertainty, they treated him with caution. Perhaps that was his inheritance after all. Not violence, not power, but the endless caution of others. People feared not what he did, but what he might one day choose to do. They feared the possibility of a roar hidden inside the whisper. At night, he sometimes sat alone with a single candle burning, its light flickering across worn walls. He thought of the stories told about his father, the myths and the horrors. He thought of the men who still revered him, even in prison, as if violence were something holy. He thought of how a name could outlive a man and how a shadow could stretch further than a lifetime. And in those quiet hours, he faced the truth he could never say aloud. His inheritance was not a kingdom, but a curse. A name too heavy to carry, a silence too deep to escape, a shadow too long to outrun. And yet he carried it, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. It was stitched into him, part of his very existence. He could live quietly, he could whisper instead of roar, he could disappear into Naples' folds. But he would always remain Salvatore Riina Jr. Not the beast, but the heir to his silence. Naples does not trust easily. It tests, it probes, it waits. The city may look chaotic, its streets noisy with motorbikes, and its markets spilling over with color. But beneath the surface it is patient. It knows how to measure a man, how to push against him until his true weight is revealed. And when Salvatore Riina Jr. settled into its shadows, Naples began its test. It started softly, almost invisibly. A stranger who lingered too long near his cafe table. A question asked casually in a marketplace. A handshake that lasted 1 second longer than it should. None of it was violent, none of it was direct. It was the Camorra's way, probing without declaring, observing without committing. They wanted to see what he would do, how he would respond, whether the son of the beast carried his father's fire in his veins. The first offers were disguised as favors. A man introduced himself as a supplier, offering better coffee beans for the cafe. Another suggested a cheaper lease for one of his apartments. A third hinted at security for his businesses, protection from petty thefts that may or may not have been staged to make the offer seem useful. To most men in Naples, these were ordinary exchanges. But to Salvatore, every offer was a test. He declined them all, politely, softly, with words chosen so carefully that they left no insult, but also no acceptance. His refusals were calm, his tone even. He did not raise suspicion by rejecting outright, but he did not step closer either. He remained in the narrow space between ally and stranger, never committing to either. But even silence is an answer. The Camorra read his refusals in their own way. Some saw him as cautious, a man who understood the weight of patience. Others saw him as weak, afraid to engage, unwilling to risk even small entanglements. A few wondered if his quiet was a mask, if behind it he was waiting, biding time, preparing to strike when no one expected it. And so the tests grew sharper. A shipment of goods destined for one of his shops never arrived. A landlord suddenly demanded higher rent. A neighbor whispered rumors that his businesses were not what they seemed. Small inconveniences, never outright threats, but enough to press against him, enough to see how he would react under pressure. Salvatore endured. He did not argue with the landlord. He paid the difference. He did not complain about the missing shipment. He found another supplier. He did not confront the neighbor. He let the rumor drift through the streets like smoke, disappearing on its own. He absorbed the tests without retaliation, without escalation. His response was silence, as always. But Naples kept watching, because in silence there is also danger. Men began to gather in back rooms, their conversations turning to the same question: what does he want? If Riina Jr. had come to claim power, why had he not acted? If he had come to hide, why did he remain in plain sight? If he wished to live quietly, why carry the name at all? The uncertainty was unsettling, and in a city built on fragile balances of power, uncertainty was dangerous. Some believed he was nothing, just a ghost living off the fragments of a legacy he could never inherit. Others suspected he was everything, a man building power so carefully that no one could see it until it was too late. In both theories, the danger lay not in what he had done, but in what he might one day do. For Salvatore, the tests were not surprising. He had expected them. He had lived his entire life under suspicion, measured by the silence of others, judged not for his actions, but for his name. Naples was no different from Palermo in that sense. The questions never changed, only the voices asking them. And so, he played his part. He remained quiet, steady, unshaken. Yet, in the stillness of his apartment, he felt the weight pressing heavier each day. The city's test was not only about patience, it was about identity. How long could he remain invisible before invisibility itself became its own kind of threat? How long could he whisper before someone demanded to hear? Whether the son of the beast had a voice of his own, he knew the truth that others could not accept. He did not seek to rule. He did not crave power, nor did he hunger for revenge or empire. But to those around him, that truth was unbelievable. A Riina who did not want power was as unnatural as a flame that refused to burn. And so, Naples waited. The city tested him with offers, with inconveniences, with rumors. It pushed him gently, then firmly, then a little harder. Not enough to break him, not enough to drive him away, but enough to measure him. Every refusal, every silence, every endurance was recorded in the unspoken ledger of the streets. In the end, the test was not about whether he would fight. It was about whether he could exist in Naples at all. Could a man with such a name live in the city's shadows without disturbing its balance? Could he walk its alleys and sit in its cafes without becoming either an ally or an enemy? Could he truly be invisible in a place where nothing stayed hidden for long? The answer, like everything about Salvatore Riina Jr., remained a whisper. He was tested, he endured, he remained. But the city was not finished with him yet, because Naples, like the Mafia itself, has patience measured not in days or weeks, but in years, and the weight of his inheritance could not be endured forever. No matter how far a man walks, he never truly leaves the place that shaped him. Naples had given Salvatore Riina Jr. space to breathe, but the air was never clean. The ghosts of Palermo clung to him, following like shadows that refused to let go. They were not flesh and blood, but memory, and memory, when bound to violence, can weigh heavier than chains. Palermo was carved into him. Its streets were imprinted on his earliest steps, its silence stitched into his childhood. He remembered the narrow alleys, where whispers carried more power than shouts, where the wrong glance could be fatal, where neighbors lived with their curtains drawn and their words measured. In Palermo, his surname was not just a name, it was a law, an unspoken force that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He had been a boy in a household where doors were locked not to keep danger out, but to keep secrets in, where dinner tables were surrounded by men whose eyes never softened, whose conversations ended the moment a child entered the room. He had grown up in a world where the walls themselves seemed to listen, where silence was more protective than love, and always there had been his father. Toto Riina, the beast. To the world he was a monster, a butcher who had turned Sicily into a battlefield. To Salvatore, he was something stranger, at once distant and suffocating. Even in prison, his father's presence filled every space. His absence was louder than most men's presence. In Naples, far from Palermo, the weight of that absence became sharper. He carried with him not only the memory of his father's rule, but also the burden of expectations. There were men still alive in Sicily who spoke of Toto Riina with reverence, as if violence had been a kind of divinity. There were others who cursed his name, but still flinched when it was spoken. And in both kinds of men, the sun was a reminder. Rumors began to seep into Naples. Whispers from Palermo carried across the water. Stories of men who still invoked the beast's name, who still believed his bloodline carried meaning. Some whispered that the son might rise where the father had fallen, reclaiming a legacy interrupted by prison bars. Others said he was nothing more than a shadow, a man who had abandoned the throne for fear of its weight. These rumors reached him, of course. They always did. In Naples, silence was never pure. It was full of echoes. He heard the murmurs in cafes, in back rooms, in conversations that hushed when he entered. Palermo was never gone. It was simply waiting, just out of sight, always pressing against him. At night, when the city quieted, the ghosts came closer. He remembered faces from his childhood, men who had sworn loyalty to his father, men who had disappeared, men who had whispered their last words in the dark. He remembered the funerals, the black clothes, the women who wept behind veils. He remembered the police sirens, the headlines, the endless cycle of blood and revenge. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could almost hear his father's voice, sharp, commanding, never gentle. The kind of voice that did not ask, but demanded. It echoed in his thoughts, reminding him of a truth. He tried to bury bloodlines do not end simply because a man chooses silence. The Camorra leaders knew this as well. They had their own ghosts, their own histories carved into Naples. But the name Riina was not local. It was foreign, Sicilian, and that made it unpredictable. They wondered, would the son of the beast eventually answer his father's ghost? Would he remain in whispers, or would the roar return through him? Salvatore himself could not answer. He lived as though each day were a negotiation with history, as if every step forward required convincing the past not to drag him back. He wanted to believe he could escape it, that Naples could be a refuge, that the silence he had built was enough. But Palermo lingered in every shadow, in every rumor, in every whisper of his name. One evening, as he walked through a narrow street lit only by the glow of a single lamp, he felt it more sharply than ever. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of the sea and the faint echo of church bells. Yet beneath it, there was something else, a weight he could not name. He stopped for a moment, looking around at the shuttered windows, the silent balconies. He was alone, yet he was not, because Palermo was there, too. It lived in the way strangers glanced at him, in the way conversations shifted when he entered a room, in the way his own reflection seemed older than his years. It lived in the weight of expectation that pressed against him, reminding him that silence, no matter how carefully chosen, could never erase blood. And so Naples became not only a city of refuge, but a city of confrontation. Here, surrounded by watchful eyes, Salvatore was forced to live with the truth he had always known: a man can escape a place, but not a name. He could walk away from Palermo, but Palermo would never walk away from him. The ghosts were patient. They whispered through walls, through rumors, through the silence of men who remembered too much. They did not demand action, not yet. They only reminded him that one day silence might not be enough. For now, Salvatore endured. He walked the streets of Naples quietly, kept his shutters closed, lived beneath the gaze of both the living and the dead. He carried the ghosts with him, as he always had. But deep down, he knew the truth. Ghosts do not follow without reason. They follow because they expect something, and sooner or later, they demand it. Anonymity is a fragile thing. It can be built carefully, stone by stone, like a wall meant to shield a man from the world. But all it takes is a single glance, a single whisper, to crack the wall open. Salvatore Riina Jr. had built his life in Naples as though he were invisible. Shadows for companions, shutters for protection, silence as his only weapon. But invisibility is never perfect. The longer he stayed, the more the city pressed against him. The Camorra had patience, but their patience had edges. They could allow a stranger to breathe among them, but not forever. And for the people of Naples, the question grew louder with each passing month: who is he really? At first, he was just another quiet man, a customer at cafes, a tenant in modest apartments, an owner of small shops that no one cared about. But the name traveled. It always did. It floated in whispers across card tables, drifted through markets, slipped into the conversations of men who lived on rumors. Riina. The name itself was enough to break his anonymity. Soon he was no longer a man without shape. He was the son of the beast. Recognition carried weight heavier than any weapon. A man could defend himself against knives, against bullets, against betrayal. But how does one defend against expectation? Against the eyes of a city that had already written a story for him, whether he wished to play the part or not. Naples demanded to know what role he would take. Would he claim his father's shadow and step into power, carving a place among the clans of the city? Or would he remain small, hiding behind shutters until the weight of his name crushed him? The Camorra tested him more boldly now. Invitations appeared, delivered quietly. A dinner at a table where men with sharp eyes and sharper knives gathered. An introduction to someone who spoke of alliances without saying the word. A whispered suggestion that he could have more control, more respect, more of what his father had once commanded. Salvatore listened, but he never agreed. He played the same game he always had: measured words, polite refusals, silence that offered no insult but no acceptance. His desire was not power but survival. Yet in a world built on hierarchy, on dominance, on voices that commanded loyalty, survival without allegiance looked suspicious. Some began to doubt his intentions. They whispered that his quiet was not peace but planning, that his refusal was not humility but calculation, that one day, without warning, the son of the beast might rise from the shadows and claim a throne he had long pretended to ignore. For Salvatore, the pressure was constant. Every glance lingered too long, every handshake seemed too firm, every silence too heavy. He felt the city's demand pressing against him. Show us who you are. Be what your name says you must be. But he resisted. His rebellion was not loud, but it was steady. He walked through Naples without bending to the roles others tried to assign him. He did not roar like his father. He did not strike like his father. He did not conquer like his father. He whispered. He endured. Still at night, when he sat alone in his apartment, the conflict gnawed at him. He thought of the prison where his father remained unbroken, still commanding respect from men who had never even seen him free. He thought of the silence in Palermo, the silence of a city still scarred by the beast's rule. He thought of his own silence, different yet the same. Could a man ever escape the destiny of his name? Could he live quietly when the world demanded he be loud? Could he remain invisible when his very blood made him unforgettable? The truth weighed heavily. His anonymity had never been his to keep. It was borrowed time, fragile and temporary, cracked by every whisper of his name. The longer he remained, the louder the city's demand would grow. And one day, silence might no longer be enough. Yet, even as the walls closed in, he chose to endure. He walked the streets of Naples quietly, refusing to be shaped by the recognition pressing against him. He lived as though invisibility were still possible, even when he knew it was slipping away, because sometimes endurance itself is a kind of defiance. And in the heart of Naples, beneath its watchful eyes, Salvatore Riina Jr. endured, not as a Don, not as a conqueror, not as a man who claimed his father's crown, but as a man who refused to let the world decide who he must be. For now that was enough, but the city was still watching. And Naples, patient as ever, would not stop demanding. A city like Naples survives on balance. Invisible lines divide its neighborhoods, quiet agreements shape its markets, and unwritten rules keep its streets from descending into endless war. Power is distributed like fragile glass, passed carefully between hands that know better than to let it fall. In such a place, even the presence of one man, silent, steady, seemingly harmless, can shift the balance, especially if that man carries a name that once terrified all of Sicily. Salvatore Riina Jr. never intended to disturb Naples. He lived carefully, choosing silence over noise, patience over aggression. But the city is sensitive. It feels the smallest tremors, the faintest changes. And the arrival of the son of Toto Riina was not a small tremor. It was an earthquake held just beneath the surface. The Camorra leaders felt it first. They measured everything by territory and reputation was currency. The Riina name, even in whispers, was a currency of its own. It carried power without needing to show power. It created unease simply by existing. And unease, in a city built on fragile pacts, was dangerous. Some clans believed his presence could be useful. A connection to Sicily, to old alliances, to a name that once commanded armies of silence. Others feared him, worried that he would one day claim authority that was not his to take. Still others watched quietly, waiting to see which way the balance would tip. But in every case, his presence was a weight. He began to notice it in the smallest details. A cafe owner hesitated a little too long before greeting him. A landlord avoided eye contact when collecting rent. A supplier delivered goods with a politeness that bordered on fear. None of these things were said out loud, but they spoke clearly enough. His name preceded him, distorted him, made him something other than the man he was trying to be. Even his own businesses, simple fronts meant to blend into the city, became points of suspicion. Was the cafe truly just a cafe? Were the apartments truly just rental properties? Was his silence truly just silence? Or was it all a mask for something deeper, something waiting to rise? The more he insisted on invisibility, the more others insisted on seeing something else. And then came the alliances. Quietly, men approached him with suggestions, partnerships, investments, a seat at a table that was not his. They spoke carefully, never outright, but always with intent. Align with us, they said without saying it. Join our side, they implied. Stand with us or against us. But he refused them all, as he always did. His words remained polite, his tone steady, his refusals cloaked in courtesy. Yet each refusal shifted the balance further. Every no created unease, left questions unanswered, left spaces that others filled with suspicion. Because in Naples, a man cannot stand apart forever. To refuse alliances is itself a statement. To remain neutral is to take a side. And in time, silence becomes louder than speech. Salvatore knew this. He felt the weight pressing against him, heavier each day. The balance of the city was fragile, and he had become a stone placed at its center. He had not asked for it, but his presence alone was enough to tilt the scales. The legacy of his father made it worse. Toto Riina's ghost was not silent. It moved through conversations, through memories, through the history of Sicily that Naples had not forgotten. To the Camorra, his father's name was a warning and a weapon. To ordinary people, it was a shadow stretching across generations. To Salvatore, it was a burden that refused to loosen its grip, and so his two worlds collided. His desire for anonymity pressed against the city's demand for definition. His wish to live quietly strained against the fragile balance of Naples. His silence became a provocation. His very existence became a challenge. At night, as he sat in his apartment with the shutters closed, he thought about the weight of it all. He thought about Palermo, about the world he had left behind but carried inside him. He thought about Naples, a city that had offered him refuge but now demanded his allegiance. He thought about his father, still alive but locked away, his shadow somehow larger than ever. And he wondered how long could this balance last? How long could he endure as a man defined by absence, when every force around him demanded presence? The truth pressed in on him from all sides. He could not erase his name. He could not rewrite his bloodline. He could not make the city forget what it already knew. The only choice left was how to carry the weight, whether to let it crush him or to stand beneath it, silent but unbroken. In the streets, the whispers grew. Men spoke of him not as a stranger, but as a possibility. Some believed he would rise, others believed he would fall, but all agreed on one thing: he could not remain as he was forever. The balance of Naples was shifting, and Salvatore Riina Jr., whether he wished it or not, was at its center. And balance, once disturbed, does not settle quietly. Loneliness can be louder than crowds. In the quiet of his apartment, behind shutters that rarely opened, Salvatore Riina Jr. felt that truth pressing against him. The city outside carried its rhythms, voices rising in markets, scooters buzzing through narrow alleys, church bells marking the passing hours. But inside, his world was still. The stillness was intentional, built carefully, but it was also suffocating. He had chosen silence as his shield. Yet silence, when carried too long, becomes its own weight. It was not only the city testing him now, it was himself. Each night stretched longer, each morning felt heavier. The walls of his apartment were not prisons, but they carried the same echo of confinement. He began to notice small changes within himself. The way his eyes flickered toward shadows that moved too quickly. The way he lingered near windows, but never stepped too close. The way footsteps on the stairs outside his door made his breath pause, just for a moment. Paranoia crept in softly, disguised as caution, but it grew. And though he never admitted it aloud, he knew that the city's watchfulness was shaping him. Every glance in the street felt heavier. Every conversation seemed layered with meaning. A stranger's nod might be respect or a warning. A neighbor's silence might be courtesy or suspicion. Living beneath constant observation had turned the ordinary into signals, the everyday into codes. Naples itself had become a mirror of his mind, restless, suspicious, always on edge. The loneliness made it worse. He had acquaintances, yes, shopkeepers, landlords, men who offered quiet greetings. But he had no friends, no confidence. Trust was a luxury he had never been allowed. To share his thoughts would be to expose them, and exposure was a risk. So he carried everything inside. His fears, his doubts, his exhaustion, all of it locked away as tightly as the shutters he kept closed. And in that isolation, the ghosts grew louder. Palermo followed him into his nights, its shadows replaying in his memory. He saw his father's face, not as it had been in photographs, but as it had been in fragments, stern, commanding, always distant. He remembered the atmosphere of his childhood home, the sudden silences, the whispers cut short, the ever-present tension that no child could name, but every child could feel. He wondered sometimes if his father felt the same paranoia, if the man called the Beast had ever sat in silence listening for footsteps that might mean betrayal. Or was his father free of such burdens, consumed instead by the certainty of power? Did the silence weigh on him, or did he thrive inside it? For Salvatore, it was not strength but erosion. His silence kept him alive, but it also hollowed him out. He lived in a city full of voices, yet had no voice of his own. He carried a name that demanded presence, but answered it only with absence. And in that conflict, he was slowly unraveling. There were moments when he longed to step outside of it all, to walk through Naples not as the son of anyone, not as a man under suspicion, but simply as himself, to sit in a cafe and laugh openly, to greet a neighbor without wondering what they thought of his surname, to live, even briefly, as though the world did not know his shadow. But such moments remained only in imagination. Reality was heavier. And yet, in this slow erosion, there was also resilience. For every night that he endured, for every day he walked the streets without breaking, he proved something, not to Naples, not to the Camorra, not even to his father's ghost, but to himself. That survival could be its own act of defiance. That endurance, however lonely, was still a form of strength. But strength does not erase cost. His eyes carried fatigue, his body carried tension, his mind carried the constant hum of paranoia. He lived each day not as a man moving freely, but as a man navigating invisible traps. And though he endured, he could not ignore the truth the silence was changing him. Naples was patient. It would keep watching, keep pressing, keep waiting for him to reveal himself. And as the city leaned closer, he felt his own walls pressing inward. He could hold them up for now. But he wondered, in the quiet hours of the night, how long they could stand before cracks began to show. Because even the strongest silence eventually trembles. And the son of the beast, no matter how determined to disappear, was still only a man. Some inherit fortune. Others inherit land, houses, legacies built from stone and steel. But Salvatore Riina Jr. inherited silence. Not the soft kind that soothes, but the heavy kind that lingers, shaping every step of a life. It was not wealth, not glory, not even freedom. It was a name, a weight, a history written long before he could walk. In Naples, he had tried to reshape that inheritance. He had lived beneath shutters, behind quiet fronts, inside shadows that asked for nothing and offered even less. He had endured the city's tests, declined its invitations, refused its traps. He had survived not by rising, but by staying low. And yet, as the years stretched, one truth became clear. He had not escaped his inheritance. He had only carried it differently, because the name was always there. It moved before him, whispered through conversations he never heard directly. It turned allies into questioners, strangers into observers, the ordinary into symbols. It was a cloak he could not remove, no matter how quietly he tried to move. Even in silence, he was never truly invisible. And so, he began to understand what his life had become. He would never be free of the shadow cast by his father. He would never erase Palermo from his blood, never silence the whispers that followed him into Naples. He could not change what he was born into, but he could decide what he would make of it. His father had ruled with fear. His father had spoken through violence, leaving Sicily scarred in ways that no time could fully heal. The beast had been a roar that shook the island, echoing long after his prison walls closed around him. Salvatore would never be that roar. He had chosen a different inheritance, the quiet, steady endurance of silence. Some might see it as weakness, to refuse power, to decline alliances, to live in shadows instead of thrones. What kind of man, they would ask, does that make him? But for Salvatore, it was not weakness. It was survival. It was rebellion in its own way. To take a name built on fear and refuse to wield it, to live beneath it rather than through it, was a choice. It was his choice. He knew the city would never stop watching. Naples had the patience of the sea. It could wait years, decades, for the truth of a man to reveal itself. And perhaps it would keep waiting forever, never fully certain of what role the son of the beast was meant to play. But he also knew that the waiting no longer defined him. The weight of expectation was there, but he had learned to carry it. At night, When the shutters were closed and the city's noise faded into whispers, he sat with the silence. It no longer pressed against him with the same sharpness. It was still heavy, yes, but it had become familiar, almost companionable. He had stopped asking whether it would break him. He had begun to understand that it was his to live with, nothing more, nothing less. The ghosts of Palermo still visited him. He still remembered the faces, the funerals, the voices that had once filled his childhood home. He still felt the shadow of his father, commanding even from a prison cell. But the ghosts did not dictate his steps. They were there, always behind him, but no longer in front of him. His inheritance was not to follow them, but to walk alongside them. And Naples itself, restless, watchful, endlessly patient, had also become part of him. The city that had tested him, that had measured him, that had pressed him from all sides, had also given him something else, a space to exist. Not freely, not lightly, but steadily. It had forced him to define himself not through power, but through endurance. And in that endurance, he had found a kind of strange peace. The world would never know him as simply a man. To many, he would always be the son of the beast, a reminder of a name that once ruled Sicily through blood and terror. But to himself, he could be more. He could be the man who carried that weight without unleashing it. The man who chose silence over fear, patience over violence, endurance over legacy. In the end, that was his story. Not a tale of conquest, not a tale of redemption, not a tale of escape, but a tale of carrying, of bearing the inheritance of silence and choosing every day not to let it consume him. And perhaps in that choice there was something stronger than power. Because power fades, thrones crumble. Legacies built on fear collapse beneath their own weight. But silence endures. In the quiet folds of Naples, behind closed shutters and unmarked doors, Salvatore Riina Jr. lived as both shadow and man. The city kept watching, the ghosts kept whispering, and the weight never left. But neither did he. He remained, not as his father's heir, but as himself.